And welcome to the Poetry Room. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and to those of you online, welcome to you as well. I see some of you are still coming into the room. That's fabulous. We have a really nice crowd tonight. So we're really delighted to have Susan Daitch with us after long last. Zedi Loew had the great honor of publishing 2 books by her, Paper Conspiracies and The Lost Civilization of Solicitor. And of course, tonight we are celebrating yet a new novel, The Adjudicator, which is published by Green City Books, which is truly a novel for our time. It grapples with the dystopian possibilities lying at the intersection of ethics and technology. Susan is the author of 6 novels and a collection of short stories. Her short fiction and essays have appeared in Guernica, Tablet, Tin House, McSweeney's, Bomb, and the list goes on and on and on. Susan's work was the subject of a review of contemporary fiction, and she's received 2 Vogelstein Foundation Awards and a fellowship from the New York Foundation for the Arts. So joining her tonight is none other than Jaron Lanier, who is no stranger to City Lights. We've hosted him before. I'm really delighted and honored to have him with us. He is a visionary computer scientist, a visual artist, computer philosophy writer, technologist, futurist, and composer of great music. We are delighted to have both of them here with us. Of course, Susan's going to be signing books at the end of the evening. For those of you online, we will have signed copies. So please give them both a warm welcome.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to be back in City Lights, and thank you, Elaine, my editor, who's out there somewhere. And I just want to thank friends and family who've traveled across the bay or from Point South to be here. And I think I have some former students out there somewhere, too. So what I thought I'd do tonight, instead of doing a sort of traditional reading, is to give you a tour of the Pangenica Corporation, which is a genetic engineering corporation that is the world of the Adjudicator, is mediated by this massive corporation that is about editing people, producing people. This is, for those of you who were born after 1980, this is a slide rule. And when I was coming here, it confused people in security at JFK, and I got really thoroughly searched. Like, they just didn't know what this was. So this is an image of the corporation Pangenica, where the Adjudicator works. And Pangenica is a complex of buildings. It's the center of the gene editing industry. And this is the campus of their main headquarters. They have facilities all over the world where human babies are made after parents' applications are approved. DNA sourced from prospective parents is engineered according to requested desirable traits in labs using gene editing. Then children are hatched from structures known as phytosacs. I'm going to spell some of these words because I'm training AI to do this correctly when people are reading the screen. So this phytosacs is Phytosacks. Phyto from the Greek to spring forth. From the Greek to spring forth. And the way the phytosacs work is that they're much faster than human gestation, and it only takes 6 months to hatch a human being from a phytosac. And infants are ready to be picked up by their parents at origination centers. And Pangenica also houses labs and offices necessary for the mechanics of Pangenica to run smoothly. This is their corporate logo, and I'll read you their mission statement. As experts in the fields of statistical genetics and bioinformatics and computational biology, the teams at Pangenica are devoted to advancing the field of genomic prediction through use of cutting-edge methodologies. Our focus is on utilizing polygenic scores and genome-wide association studies to improve our understanding of the genetic basis of disease and human behavior. We apply advanced machine learning algorithms to our work to continually refine our outcomes. And this is the entrance to Pangenica. at 8,000 Consolidated Shore Drive, Civitas Medina Industrial Park. And I'll say something about this image because this is probably the last time I'm going to do this Pangenica tour, so I'm going to reveal where some of these images are from. This was a picture that I took on Park Avenue in New York City, and I was looking at corporate entrances, and I gave myself some limitations. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't want to talk to anyone at a reception desk or security, and I also didn't want reflections of traffic in the glass. So I don't know what this building was, but it looked like what I imagined the main entrance to Pangenica would look like. And there are, in the actual building, there are security stations on either side, and that's actually also figures in the book. Security getting in and out of Pangenica is important. So that's the entrance. And we'll take the elevator up to the top of Pangenica where there are roof gardens. And this is where plants are developed. Plants aren't subject to the same ethics as humans and animals. Breeding vegetation isn't without risks, but doesn't come under the same scrutiny. You can see the ocean in the background. And this Wizard of Oz house is used for equipment. To store equipment. This is, some of you will know that this is actually the roof of the engineering building of UC San Diego. It's still there. It's still there. This is another shot of the roof garden. And here's where hybrids are grown, such as plants that are able to recognize and communicate with one another via root systems, breeds of dynamite trees, which disperse seeds at speeds of 160 miles per hour, and zombie plants. That have no leaves or roots, but steal nutrients from plant hosts. This is another shot of the roof garden. This is also the focal point for extreme weather, so plants that are flood and wind resistant are also grown up here. These are hanging columns of ferns, moss, and orchids. They're designed to filter airborne lead and radiation and improve oxygen levels. And this image was, I took this picture at the Perez Museum of Art in Miami, and it has these massive, it seems like just perfect image for what I imagined was on the roof garden. These are these massive columns with plants growing out of them. This is the Steenbeck Department of Data Collection and Gene Editing. This is where genetic material is collected and processed. And this is a very, very simple diagram of the CRISPR process. This is it's way, way, way more complicated than this, as you can imagine. But this is basically, this is in Spanish. But this would be, this is the messenger RNA. And what it does is it cuts parts of DNA double helix, and Cas9 is a genome editing tool that uses guide RNA to target and modify specific DNA sequences. And messenger RNA directs the Cas proteins to a specific location in the genome. This is the recombinant processing center. And this is our an example of proprietary DNA analysis, where cells from DNA are analyzed, bits of proteins harvested and put to use or discarded. And this is an image from the Tate Modern Gallery. This is the work of Helen Chadwick. And the idea that I was thinking, I was imagining, cells doing what cells do. And in her work, she would take images like you can see, maybe you can see here. This is a dandelion, and there's a retina, I think, over there, and they were broader images of larger organisms that are intended to signify cells. So I use that for Pangenica. This is the preparation of genetic material before phytosac implantation. And this is where the genetic material is assembled and prepared. And these are the phytosacs. So you can see the phytosacs, the gradations of phytosacs as the material, as the embryos, they're this stuff called phytobase that I invented, that is a nutrient-rich substance that is automatically replenished. And this actually, I found this. This is a work by the sculptor Jenny Kendler. It's called Other of Pearl, and there's an island off New York City called Governor's Island, which was where Gorbachev and Reagan met to negotiate. And since that happened in whatever year that was, 1980 something, the island fell into disrepair, and then it became an art space. And it's destined for luxury condo towers and more corporate structures. But that's another story. But this was in a basement of an abandoned building where she installed this work, Other of Pearl, and it's about origin stories and climate change and considering oysters and whales as central players positioned somewhere between human and non-human. And she's interested in water and capital. So that became phytosex filled with phytobase. And somewhere in there are little people. Not really, but that's how I imagined it. This is the Origination Center. This is our state-of-the-art waiting room facility. And this is where people pick up their infants. This is a picture of one of the waiting rooms, and this is where two mothers, whose children will turn out to have something of each other, this is where they're going to meet. And this is the Department of Adjudications. And this is where Zedi Loew, the adjudicator, works, on this, behind one of the doors in this corridor. Zedi has an anomaly. She has mirror touch synesthesia, which is supposed to be edited out generations ago, so she has to hide her ability. And mirror touch is a form of synesthesia where you feel what everyone around you is feeling. And so she has to keep this secret. It also makes her very good at her job. She's almost too good at ferreting out fraud, and even still, since there are fewer and fewer complaints, she's been relegated to more outdated forms of technology, which you can see here. Yeah, this is her office, and you can see there's, scissors, an old computer, old landline. There's a couple of bottles of pills that I'll get to later, what those are for. And over here, you can see rejected censored books, like Ulysses is there, Lolita, Sons and Lovers, and she's relegated to this sort of backwater office, despite the sort of lumen-like exterior, if anybody's watching Severance. It's got this sort of lumen-like affect to the architecture, but her office actually looks like this. And this is from a piece by an installation artist named Mark Dion, who, this is called, in real life, it's called the Bureau of Censorship. And it's this little wooden structure, like a little house, a little sort of edicule. And you look inside, and this is what you can see when you peer inside. But what is an issue for Pangenica, and they have something called theoretical risk management processes. What they don't want to happen is something like this. Looks like a subway car with a reptile head, and a woman who looks like she's from the 1940s is looking on in horror. So this is what Pangenica wants to avoid. And this image was from the Freud Museum in London, and it was in a display about dreams. But that's something Pangenica would want to avoid. So how did Zedi Loew become an adjudicator? She got into law school. She was able to do that, but she had trouble sitting for exams because she would feel what everyone around her was feeling, and she was unable to focus. And so the bar exam was pretty much out of the question. But in a class on fraud, she developed a special interest in the Iron Mountain Report. And this is a real thing. I didn't make this up. The Iron Mountain Report, published in 1967, purported to be a leaked report authored by a special study group tasked by the Kennedy administration to plan the transition from a wartime economy and to assess the potential social impacts of, quote, a condition of general world peace. The book promoted continual states of conflict for economic gain, but was written as a hoax and went out of print in 1980. But it was picked up in the late 20th century by militia groups. It was taken up by militia groups who believed it was true, and they began circulating it on the internet as a factual document. While in law school, Zedi was fascinated by how the invented could take on a life of its own And so one of her professors recommended her to adjudications, investigating cases for pangenica. At pangenica, it was suspected that anyone who complained would have to be inventing flaws where there couldn't possibly be any. Pangenica rarely settled cases, and Zedi was very, very good at her job, exposing fraud and scams. So the morning in question, where the book opens, Zedi comes to work, and there's a file on her desk. This is the Lanier file, which I'll spell for the AI here. It's Lavener. And this is paper, rather than usually, it would arrive digitally in an email attachment. And it wasn't unusual for files to be on paper. Some documents proved to be safer if they were not digitalized. And this file is a very dangerous file. The Lanier case involved a mother, Singe Lanier, who believed her daughter, Pom Pom, this is Pom Pom, believed that her consciousness was switched with another child, that of a boy, Clayton. And both children were picked up at the origination center. At the same moment, the mothers became friends, but over time, Ms. Lanier believed something was amiss about the two children. Something of Pom Pom resembled what should be Clayton, and something of Clayton resembled Pom Pom. After Clayton doesn't survive past age 13, Ms. Lanier felt she could go forward with her complaint, her suspicions that one child had the consciousness of the other. In her file, she states she doesn't seek monetary damages, only that pangenica acknowledged what they'd done and that they'd done so intentionally. Clayton had been obsessed with, among other things, the Fermi paradox, and in his obsession, Ms. Lanier, who was not his mother, saw something of her own pattern of obsessiveness. In her case, Singe was an originist. That is to say, she worked returning artifacts and art objects to their places of origin, even if those places of origin no longer exist. And because the file has to give the adjudication department and the adjudicator in particular a lot of information about the plaintiff, so we're going to look a little bit at the history of Singe Lanier and what she does as an originist. So these are some of the objects she's working on repatriating. These are objects from the Freud Museum. And since pangenica has discredited Freud, since they believe all behavior is genetically produced, his museum is being dismantled. Etruscan art goes back to Tuscany, even if Tuscany is underwater. Ming Dynasty objects go back to China. Mughal prints go back to Lucknow and Lahore. And here's more of the objects from the Freud house that she's working on. And this is Henry Moore's studio as reproduced in the Boston Museum of Fine Art. And this is one of the objects that Henry Moore had is a Triceratops skull. This is destined for Boulder, Colorado. I mean, nobody knows exactly where the skull came from, but Colorado is a very Triceratops rich area. So that's going back to Colorado. There are also Native American artifacts from the Winnebago and Fox tribes that Henry Moore collected when he made a sculpture called Nuclear Energy at the University of Chicago. And that sculpture, Nuclear Energy, was on the site of Enrico Fermi's laboratory. The replicas of Native American objects that he got at gift shops, those can stay where they are. They don't have to go back, but everything else has to go back. And this is the Hall of Asian Peoples from the Museum of Natural History. And this is, all of this stuff has to go back to where it came from. This is in the back, you can see the Gate of Ishtar, which is made out of blue tile, and that's in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. And all these other things, I'm not sure if they actually come from Iraq, but they have to go back to where they came from. And this is a bust of Yuri Gagarin, the Soviet cosmonaut who was the first person to go to outer space in 1961. And this is a problem. Where should she send it to? Because the Soviet Union no longer exists. So where is it going to go? I'm going to say one thing about the book. My editor put in these QR codes. So as you're reading, you can hold up your phone. And on this page, you'll hear PJ Harvey singing Yuri Gagarin, is the name of the song. And those are sort of sprinkled throughout the book. So if I reference DNA or the LIGO detector, you hold your phone up and you'll see an animation about them. But there's also a lot of music because we couldn't get, it's very difficult to get the rights for music. So what he did is he put in music videos. There's one of, for example, there's one of Tom Jones on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1967 singing "It's Not Unusual." And that's there to signal it happens in a scene where there's this kind of sleazy character, and I wanted to signal that he has a particular agenda that is going to give the adjudicator a hard time. And so he's singing "It's Not Unusual." You hold your phone up, you get to see Tom Jones on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1967 dancing and singing "It's Not Unusual." So those are kind of fun, and they're sprinkled throughout the book. So so part of the file is missing, and Zedi has to find it. And despite all the documentation, copies of the original Lanier admissions forms are missing, and the adjudicator needs to locate them. Her first stop is the Department of Admissions and Audit Results. Admissions within the context of Pangenica means two things. It is admissions, it means admissions, Pangenica's services and applications are by necessity deep dives into family history. Admissions can also mean unmasking family secrets. And this is another view. This is actually an installation by a British Nigerian artist, Yinka Shonibar. This is from the Serpentine Gallery in London. And his work, it's commenting on colonialism and cultural appropriation. And all these books are covered with different kinds of fabric that have particular signification for the cultures that they're meant to represent. There was, I don't know, thousands of them, and you can't take them out, obviously, so I don't know what's inside them, if anything, but it really was an amazing piece. So it's determined that part of the file she's looking for, it should be in admissions and audits. It's not. So where is it? It's in the Department of Classified Archives and Records. And that's in another wing of the facility. And the adjudicator doesn't have security clearance to enter, so she's going to have to find this information from other sources. And this is where, in the process to fill in the gaps in the file, she has an encounter with a man named Waxman. And he is the architect of the experiment. He's the director of the Department of Neuronal Correlates, and he's the architect of the experiment of switching consciousnesses. He was the person who put the Lanier file on her desk in the middle of the night, and is the director of the neuronal correlates. He's a sort of Oppenheimer-like figure in that he thinks he can control the location and use of consciousness on the genome. But once the genie is out of the bottle, there's really no putting it back in. And if you can control consciousness, you can control populations. And that's another piece by Mark Dion. That's another installation that he had in a different location that is from a show he did with another artist, Alexei Rockman, who both artists are really interested in mapping out the natural world and also talking about climate change. So this is the consciousness reassignment prototype over here. And this is the lab space. Waxman likes to work at night. There's, Waxman tells the adjudicator, well, we were looking at the neural correlates of consciousness, which parts of the brain are firing when you experience a splinter, a kiss, the taste of an orange, or chocolate. We want to know how a protein taps a nerve, a dendrite, a synapse. You feel fear, and you run as fast as you can, and how quickly conjecture turns into the possible. And the director is soon to become the ex-director. There are characters that get rid of other characters in this book. They're called disappearachniks. And I wrote those before November 6th, like 2024. And it turns out that we actually, disappearachniks are turning out to be a real thing, actually, but as we know. But I was thinking about them way before then. So this is one of the lower levels of the main building of Pangenica, where Zedi has no access to what goes on in these sub-basements, but she's going to find out. This is where behavioral studies, like the Milgram experiment, is conducted, which is the Milgram experiment, which was an experiment done at Harvard, where I think I could have some of this wrong, but I think it was about why people do what they do. Why do people commit crimes? Why do people commit atrocities? And a subject, it was Harvard students, I think, would enter a room and someone in a white coat would tell them to inflict, turn a dial up, and someone in another room would get a shock. If they did, I think if they made a mistake on a test, they would get a shock. In fact, they were just actors. And the Milgram experiments turns up a lot in the end of Pangenica when Zedi is finding out a little bit about how behavior is channeled. It's in what Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was one of the students who was exposed to the Milgram experiment, and I think it sort of had a terrible effect on him. So these experiments are about obedience, persuasion theory, and the use of deep fakes. And here's some of what you would find in the basement of Pangenica. So the last slide is, this is a drug that called dormazine. And many in the world of Pangenica find a way to cope with the pressures of the pressures that gene editing places on them with a drug called dormazine, which renders concentrated sleep. For example, the lowest dosage is you would take one and you would sleep for 7 hours, but you'd get the benefits of having slept for 8 hours. And those are very pale blue, so they get darker blue, they're stronger. So it could go up to, say, if you take a very strong dormazine, you would sleep for 1 hour and get the benefits of 8 hours of sleep. But they're highly addictive and they affect the language centers of the brain. And they're legal, but they can also be bought on the street. And the street dormazine pills are called natties. And there are a couple characters in the book who are addicted to dormazine. One of them is Zedi's mother, who lives on a lighthouse island, and that is going to matter also at the end. So that's a sort of general tour of Pangenica and some idea of what happens in the Adjudicator. That's it. Any questions or I don't know where laptop did it for this.
Okay. I mean, I think there's a hazard to your presentation in this particular area in that someone in the audience might get confused and actually fund it. And so you have to be very careful with fictitious tech companies around here.
I know.
Because we don't care anymore. Like we'll fund them, you know. And I can already imagine who the board is, and
oh, great!
The bogus crypto it'll issue, and
of course, yeah.
like it's also clear. So I love the way you've illustrated it using works of art from people out there working. I think that's a really great way to do it, because the cliche these days would be to get one of the AI programs to synthesize images, and there's something so vacant about that. So I think that was a wonderful choice.
Well, I think it's, one of the issues with writing this book is how do you visualize this universe? And I used images that I had seen as I travel around, and they oddly sort of fit what I was looking for too, even though they're totally out of context. And I think Jenny Kendler, who did the piece in Governor's Island, never imagined that those blobs that were meant to represent oysters, I was going to turn into phytosacs.
No, the next thing that will happen, even though this company doesn't exist, is you're going to be sued by Elon, who will claim he was a founder of it. And so just prepare yourself.
Okay.
Yeah. So I have a question for you.
Sure.
You said something a little cryptic to me, I think this morning, where you said you read something of mine that convinced you you'd gotten something wrong about consciousness.
Yeah.
And I said, well, welcome to the club.
Yeah.
I mean, like, anybody who says they understand consciousness, well, just don't buy crypto from that person.
Yeah, okay.
But,
yeah.
I'm curious what you meant.
Well, some of your work that I've read about consciousness and some of the things that I've seen, I think that it's so complicated, but also in order to talk about genetic engineering and consciousness, which is something that's been done. I didn't invent that. You have to define consciousness. You can't just say, well, it's that bit over on that allele over there. You have to be able to define it, and that's something nobody can really do. And there are lots of interesting attempts, and some of them are at cross purposes. And I think you said you're down the middle, kind of.
Well, that's the least fashionable place to be these days.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
of course it's enticing.
Yeah. I mean, what I think also, so I wanted to work with this idea of switch consciousnesses. And I think, but I also had to do it within a fictional framework, within a story that would make sense. So as I was using consciousness on the parts of the two children, what initiates Sinja's suspicion is actually probably not consciousness, but more like personality, maybe. Like the Pom-Pom is a very acidic person, and Clayton is obsessive. And that's really more like personality, that's not consciousness, except that the way they see the world, the way consciousness kind of mediates experience, then it begins to trigger her suspicions that something is wrong with the two children and something's been switched. But you have to take it on a leap of faith that someone was able to do this and do that kind of experiment in a Petri dish, and then it became a phytosac. But in fact, if it could be done, it would be, a phenomenal control of people. So it's something to be, I hope Elon Musk doesn't go near it, but who knows?
Yeah, I mean, there are many gradations of what we might be talking about with consciousness, and
Yeah.
The varieties of consciousness that might be manipulated in this way, where you could switch them between people, are probably different than some sort of ultimate mystical or dualistic consciousness or something. But if consciousness is something very core about the character of a person, that is a real thing, and surely it must be physiological at some point.
At some point, yeah.
I remember Oliver Sacks talking about how if there was a patient with dissipating mentality, the very, very, very last thing would be their sense of individualness, that there was some essence of them or some quality that was, that you couldn't really put your finger on, but that was their take on the world, and that thing would be there even when they'd lost their memory and their ability to talk or anything. There was like something that just was very, very core. And we know very little about that thing, and we don't know the nature versus nurture of it. But of course, the great terror of this moment is that we are altering it with kids growing up on, social media and soon falling in love with their AI partners or whatever, this whole constellation of things. And we just don't know how deep these really can cut. And so we don't know to what degree your work of fiction is really a work of fiction or not.
I hope it's mostly fiction.
Isn't that horrible? Wouldn't it be nicer to know?
It would.
It would be nice.
Yeah. Someone has their hand up, I think.
Could we?
We'll fit.
You can, because they're not going to be able to hear you.
Okay.
We've got two different groups, one online, one here.
I came in late and also needed to run for a class, but thinking about the concept of consciousness, and given that there are startup companies that's working on brain upload, brain emulation, so I don't know, it's my first time coming to a book club like this, but what's your thought or our understanding about the versions of consciousness and the storage of the consciousness and connections, conversations between versions of consciousness, the dead and alive, whatever that is? It just feels like it could happen in the near future.
I'm not sure I totally understand the question. Maybe that was more of a comment. I'm not sure.
I don't know what the question to ask.
Okay.
Maybe it's about if this story covers any aspects about the consciousness, storage of consciousness, and maintain it after someone passes away.
Oh, no, I didn't get involved in any of that. I mean, that's interesting stuff. You know, consciousness, I think one of the issues with consciousness is you can't measure it, right? And a lot of hard science is about measurement. And so I think also if you're going to, can you store consciousness, that opens up a whole other can of worms.
Well, I don't think you can measure it. In the Turing test, we sort of make a claim that a magician can measure it, because if somebody can be fooled, we treat that as a measurement instrument, which I think is the most insane idea in the whole history of science. And it has a lot of competition. We can certainly fund it. The AI companies often have teams that are concerned about the emotional well-being of an AI or whatever garbage. I'm sorry. I should be nicer to my community, but sometimes it just gets exhausting. But I think if once again, there's different things that consciousness can be. If it's the thing that we would like to turn off during surgery, if it's the thing anesthesiologists are concerned about, that's physiological and that's studyable, that's measurable, that's boundable. Yeah. If we're talking about the existence of experience itself, that's, I think, extremely important, but it's something else. It's a different epistemological channel, as we say when we like syllables. And and that notion that it might be something separate and special is the thing that the AI community is constantly prodding against in order to annoy people and get more and more attention, which turns into money the way we've set things up. So there is no consciousness. You can buy my crypto here. Like that we freak people out about whether it's real as a way of getting attention, because there's something so kind of weirdly annoying about that. People can't get that out of their heads, and then we get the attention, and then that does turn into money and power, weirdly. So there's a whole political economy angle to consciousness these days that maybe has only been present maybe in religions before. Maybe we're a religion, I don't know.
But I think we can talk about the absence of consciousness, whether that's, when you're under anesthesia, when you're asleep, when you're dead. And nobody wants to get a new consciousness. Nobody says, I don't like mine, I'd like to trade it in for a new one. And I don't think, even if you could do that, who would want to do that?
Well, even the lack of consciousness can only be based on faith. You don't really know to what degree you've just forgotten if you were conscious in sleep, or for that matter in surgery or whatever. And one of the little school kid fascinations these days when you hear them talking about things is, did you know that when you go under anesthesia and surgery, you actually experience all the horrible pain, but then you forget it when you come out? And I love that sort of thing because it's logically consistent, and it does point out how even if consciousness in others is an act of faith, so is lack of consciousness either in others or in ourselves. It's actually a sophisticated little kid obsession. Yeah.
That's true. Harsha? Oh, okay.
Please.
If we could pass the mic.
Susan, I noticed that the slides that you showed us were primarily of spaces that were relatively confined and dedicated to some form of control, right?
Yeah.
Control of human populations, control through technology, and so forth. But that there were also these moments where you had characters in the novel who were primarily preoccupied with displacement, right? That is to say, the displacement of one consciousness onto another, or the repatriation of displaced objects.
Right.
And it strikes me that, in dystopian fiction, very often what is generative of plot has to do with some kind of tension between order and disorder, right? Regularity and contingency. And I was wondering if your novel follows that pattern of where things only, because utopias are static, right? nothing can really happen in a utopia if it's successful. So how does plot happen? And does it happen through the mechanisms that you touched upon, but which you didn't elaborate?
Thanks, that's a great question. Well, when I was thinking about writing science fiction, which I hadn't done before, there are certain ready-mades with science fiction that you can use and you can also undercut. And they're very, usually very bleak visions. There's a lot about, they could be very paranoid. There's a lot about state control, state surveillance, and I wanted to use those but also undercut them to a certain extent. And I was thinking about also my launching pad was the science. And that actually began with, I was going to these talks at Pioneer Works, which is an art and technology space in Brooklyn. And there'd be all kinds of, the way they were curated is two scientists would take different views on subjects like what are black holes, are we alone in the universe, what is consciousness? And the one that really struck me, the one that really stayed with me was Siddhartha Mukherjee's talk about CRISPR, about genetic engineering. And he talked about, he had an uncle in Mumbai who was schizophrenic, and he was interested in the genetic strafing of that trait through his family. And so I wanted to use those things, but how do I use those things in a way that is not just repeating the usual constructs of science fiction? And then I was also thinking of how we use science in fiction, going back to, say, Jules Verne, and when he was thinking about 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or Journey to the Center of the Earth, maybe he was thinking about French colonial adventurism, going to Mozambique, going to Tahiti, going to Pondicherry. And then you jump up to E.M. Foster with The Machine Stopped. And that was, I think, 1909. And it was before World War I.
Something, maybe 07, but something like that.
So it was just before World War I, when certain kinds of technologies were just, what are airplanes, what is electricity? And it didn't yet, I don't think science fiction yet had a tremendously martial force to it, which it certainly began to. And then Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which was a big influence on The Adjudicator. He was in Hollywood, in Los Angeles, and you can see how the entertainment industry affected how he thought about the future. And then if you jump up to 1984, which I think was published in 1947, and I think that was really reflecting Orwell's experience in the Spanish Civil War. So I think it's a lot of, what's interesting to me about science fiction is, you do have these dystopian ready-mades, but how do you take from the reality that we all know, the wingnuts and the grommets and a world where gravity works? I don't know if that makes sense, yeah. Any other questions?
Maybe a related question. Maybe a related question, but when I think of genetic engineering, I think of sort of an erasure of origins. There are no more origins. We just make things in the lab. Everything is severed from its origin. So I just was curious about the fact that at the same time you have this idea of repatriation, objects going back to their original places, an almost absurd devotion, almost comical devotion to returning things to their place of origin. I just wonder what you're thinking about with that contrast between
well,
two
I think
things.
Singe is desperate to find out where her daughter Pom Pom came from. And in theory, if she's going to act on her kind of personal mandate that things need to be returned to where they came from, where is Pom Pom going to go? Where is her daughter going to go? She feels sort of very alienated from her, but she's still her daughter. So there is, that theme of going back to origins, but what if you can't?
There's an almost religious drive in tech culture to make life as friction-free as possible, to make whatever possibilities you might like as available as possible. So your rideshare shows up magically, even though there's actually some poor soul there being your driver, but you fantasize it'll be a robo car or something, and perhaps with a designer baby, you get your ideal baby. But the thing about no friction is it also means no place, because locality can only be defined by friction. It's the effort to get from one place to another that makes one place distinguishable from another place. And so there's an ultimate kind of destination, which of course we won't achieve, but the fantasy is that we'll turn the universe into a single point where in a way nothing happens anymore. You know, so it's sort of like the tech version of entropy, heat death, or something like that, where just everything becomes so equally available, and your AI generator can generate any possible human having any experience instantly, and so on. So I think we, at any given moment, we want less friction, and yet we can sense that it's annihilating us with each step we take, and there's our problem.
Any other questions? Alvin?
Maybe going back to the question around writing science fiction, your novels often seem, or probably are, deeply researched. In fact, they're often about the act of conducting research. I was just wondering, like, there's obviously a lot of research that went into the Adjudicator that we've been talking about here, but it's all science and technology based, as opposed to your past novels, which tend to be historical and cultural research based. And I was just wondering if there was a kind of qualitative difference to writing that way.
This was a lot more fun. Right. And I think, you know, my second book, The Colorist, was about comics. And that and some of my short things have not used history either. But this was, I think, something that was chasing me for a while. And it was great to try to go there. My father was a physicist, so I grew up in a house where the idea was that, you know, you wanted to know how things worked, whether it was a catalytic converter or a redwood tree. We always had to, you know, machines in my house were always turning into other machines. My father was a great do-it-yourself sort of person. And we were always, you know, we wanted us to know how things were made, whether it was soda or bullets. I had my own private operation, cast lead. And I mean, so so there was that impulse that I kind of ran away from and then went back to, I think, with this book and some other things I've written as well. Yeah.
Can I share with the audience what you told me about the slide rule you brought?
Oh, sure, yeah.
So this is your father's slide rule.
Yeah.
And he worked with Robert Oppenheimer and
He tested his math in the early 1950s, yeah.
So you think Oppenheimer's DNA is on this
It's
thing?
possible.
So we could clone Oppenheimer off the slide rule.
Maybe we could, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you were asking if I remembered how to use it, and I adore these things. I love them and miss them, and I think it's kind of criminal that kids aren't learning with them these days.
I have no idea how that thing works. So I've done events in Washington and in New York, and I'm still in touch with a lot of my childhood friends, and it was all our fathers who were physicists or mathematicians. And we all know that our dads went to work with those things. And a lot of my childhood friends are, you know, they even became mathematicians and physicists, and they don't know how they work either. So I'm astounded you actually know how this thing works.
Yeah, they're not that hard to understand. They really aren't.
Yeah.
They're not that hard at all. I'll show you after the thing.
Sure, okay.
They're really great. I just love them. Yeah. And it's a really physical way of feeling math in your fingers, and the loss of that is great.
Oh, okay, sure.
All right.
So Liv says, will you be touching on disability erasure and I guess eugenics in the story with the inclusion of things like CRISPR?
In the world of Pangenica, there is no disability. But in the opening chapter, the opening section, I mean, that's the whole point of Pangenica, is they eliminate everything. And one of the things that drew me to this subject were questions of medical ethics. And this was something Siddhartha Mukherjee talks a lot really brilliantly, is that what do you decide you're going to cut out and what do you decide is going to stay in? And so when the book opens, Zedi Loew is reading a book called The Shadow Prince, which is about an actual person, Eugene of Savoy, who I've used him in my last book as well. He's a really fascinating character. And he was a hunchback dwarf who was also queer and probably the illegitimate son of Louis XIV. And he hung out, there was a whole gay subculture in France, in Paris, at that, whatever that was, end of the 17th century. And Louis XIV wanted him to become a monk. He wanted to get rid of him. And Eugene was very martial. He wanted to fight wars. He was a real military guy. And so he disguised himself dressed as a woman and made his way to Vienna, where they recognized him as this military sort of genius. And he was responsible for kicking the Turks out of Europe in one of the last battles between the Turks and the Austrians. And he was so vicious that there was a particular panzer division that was named after Eugene of Savoy. But who he was very different from how he presented himself physically. And so when Zedi is reading about him, she's really baffled, because in the world of Pangenica, someone like that absolutely cannot exist. Oh.
So then is it more than just, it's not socioeconomic reasons that people use phytosacs, it's almost mandated then?
So if you have to take this as a leap of faith, that people can no longer have children the oldfashioned way, that nobody does that. And if anybody does, the disparachniks will come for you. Oh. So everyone is genetically engineered. So it's a kind of, it's advertised as sort of being more democratic. You get to make these choices, and nobody has any, disabilities. Which is where sort of Zedi's job comes in, because Pangenica is supposed to do things in a very seamless way, so there should be no complaints. But of course there are. So, yeah. Vivek?
Here, we'll run it over to you.
Hi. So Susan, there's so much beauty in accidents, in art, in relationships, loss, all of these things. We know this, right? Yeah. So I wonder whether Pangenica doesn't realize that there's beauty in irregularity.
That's a good question, but they would be terrified of irregularity. And there are these things I think I talk about called jumping genes that actually are things that occur. And that is the cause of extreme anxiety in the world of Pangenica. So you're right. I mean, so this is presented as a world where that is not, what you've just said, which is wonderful, is not a possibility. It's sort of like, I think Pangenica is like the ultimate environment of anxiety and control. Yeah. But I wish it were otherwise.
You're making a comment on that.
Yeah. Okay, ready?
Susan, I wonder if you could say something about the sadism that was switched from between Clayton and Pom Pom in terms of Clayton's death, and the way in which that was really what prompted Singe to understand that something went wrong in the breeding.
Yeah.
Because when you were talking about consciousness and autonomy, I was thinking about conscience.
Yeah, well, in fact, Zedi's mother, Dot, who is a dormazine addict, and she does a lot of, it affected the language centers of her brain. And when she confuses conscience and consciousness. And in fact, if you look at it that way, I mean, that Pom Pom, who is sort of a consummate bully, has no conscience either. In fact, it was interesting when I was writing her, my editor said, she has to be meaner. And it was a mistake, because if the consciousnesses were switched, then a lot of things are off about each child. And so, I mean, you wouldn't really want, you wouldn't want a child to have that kind of meanness, kind of bullying nature. But it's also, she's very good at giving a different image to the world. In fact, a lot of her phone is involved in that, which is also, kids and social media and phones. So she has the capability to mask herself to a certain extent. But that's a great question. Yeah. Anyone else? Any other questions? Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Jaron.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And I really congratulate you on the new book, and I wish you the warmest success with it. And I'm very pleased to have a chance to support you and
Thanks.
help
Thank
launch
you.
it. Yeah.
All right.